Hi. Recently, I had a student that came to me that read an article that explained that bipolar disorder had come from ancient tribal societies where presence of someone that could really focus, really stay alert and awake for days greatly benefited them. These people would be ideal guards or something. The student went on to say that having bipolar disorder is, of course, horrible for someone today. The student has brought up in class discussions where he had a friend who had bipolar disorder and how it was affecting his life. And of course, that friend is he. He told me that he was on 5 different medications, but he still struggles to control manic episodes. He wonders where on earth this could have come from. And when he's in a manic episode, he feels like he's haunted by the useless vestige of an ancient era. The student asked for my thoughts, and here they are. Now, this is not an attempt to change psychological paradigms. This is simply an attempt to hopefully make this student feel better about the brain that he wound up with. There are many different ways to look at the question of where psychological conditions came from. I'm a cognitive psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, so I study how the brain functions and not how it fails to function. In this way, I feel that labeling them as disorders is misleading and oftentimes harmful. People tend to embody their labels. It's the problem of labeling. You are no longer a person with your own idiosyncratic brain. You are now OCD, Tourette's. You are a walking embodiment of some disorder. To help us understand psychological conditions, simplify the brain. Break it down into traits, behaviors, tendencies, and then take those traits and look at them on a continuum, and keeping in mind the whole population, all the people around you. We already look at many different traits in this way. Look at measuring intelligence using IQ. We use a spectrum ranging from 0 to maybe 200. Apparently Stephen Hawking, seen here floating in the vomit comet, has an IQ greater than 200. Though he would deny the validity of using IQ to measure intelligence. The majority of people on this scale, 95% of us, would be somewhere between 70 and 130, where the average person is 100. We can look at a scale between passive and neurotic, and if they are near the passive side, we might call them lackadaisical. We would describe them by their behavior, by their tendency to be more passive. On the other side of the scale, once you get high enough, then we start calling you OCD. Now this person has a label. But what's behind that label is not that much different between normal and OCD. They're just a little bit further on the scale. With bipolar disorder, we'll probably have to look at least 2 scales. The first would measure mood, depressed to manic. And this would be a measure of just overall your tendency to be in this mood for a significant amount of time, not really looking in the normal ups and downs any person is going to have within a day and a week and whatnot. On the extreme end of depression, we would give them the label major depression disorder. On the other side, we have mania. We'd also have to think of a scale for how likely you are to migrate from one side to the other, especially to either poles. Those high on this scale, we'd probably start to give the label bipolar. And of course you can think of 2 or 3 different types of scales to add to this. For example, scales that measured how often or how quickly you made this migration. People high on these scales we'd call rapid cycling bipolar. But in fact, a real working model using spectrums like these would not look this simple. There's behaviors that are way too complex. You'd have to add in more than 2 factors. You would perhaps have a spectrum as a triangle or a circle, like a color wheel, where you map certain traits along their gradient. So now that we can see all of these different traits as being normally distributed on a spectrum, we can start to make sense of why this is advantageous. In a Darwinian manner, different brain types are tried out. And those combinations that help the individual and help their community, they are more likely to reoccur. And there are several examples like the one my student brought up that show exceptional traits that benefit a group. This article explains one such. In a way, it sort of suggests that without alcoholism, we would not have evolved to be the dominant species on this planet. You see, alcoholism is sometimes a side effect of people who have very high disposition for sensation seeking. They always want to be active. They want to be occupied with something. And when they're idle, this can lead to very self-destructive behaviors. If they have something to engage them, then they can benefit their group by being the person that leads an expedition, someone that charges into battle, someone that is always interested in seeking out novel situations and bringing it back to the group. Michael from Vsauce goes into this topic in an incredible video called
Why Do We Get Bored?
An example from nature would be the meerkat. Meerkats burrow a den into the ground that keeps them safe from predators, but when they have to leave the den to forage, they're exposed. A certain percentage of meerkats are born with this compulsion, this meerkat OCD. This compulsion causes them to stand on rocks, branches, and other high points and look out for predators. When they see a predator approaching, they start to bark and screech, and it alerts all the other meerkats to run to the den. This is also the meerkat that is the first to look out and see if the coast is clear. As you would expect, these are the meerkats that are most likely to be eaten. However, when they're not present in a population, a predator is much more likely to wipe out a large number of meerkats when they strike. So this begins to illuminate how such traits could be passed down through the generations. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Selfish Gene, explains how evolution doesn't favor the individual that goes on to mate. It actually favors the individual genes that get passed on from generation to generation. So the meerkats in one group have this set of sensory genes. If you are the lucky meerkat to have the right combination of sensory genes and they're activated, then you get to be the bait. So while the century might die, the community thrives by the presence of those genes, and they will survive to pass those down to later generations. So this may be why certain arrangements of the human brain have coalesced and persist through the ages. It may be good that the majority of people are somewhere in the middle of these spectrums. We oftentimes call them normal. But it may be beneficial that these people are born with these arrangements of their brain that makes them neurotic, sensation-seeking, or just plain strange. So this might explain where bipolar disorder came from. These conditions may have been advantageous for ancient, early, tribal, or nomadic people. And the modern brain has evolved little, if at all, from those ancient origins. What we have are these tribal brains in a modern world. So the effects these conditions have on a person in the modern world and what role they play in society is ultimately up to them. But then again, for that matter, the effects of our tribal brains and how they affect anyone is really up to them.